Master Treasurer, distinguished guests, fellow benchers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to have the privilege of introducing today's event. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I actually wanted to address you from the floor, but the cameraman was having nothing of it. He didn't want me walking around. And you may ask why I wanted to address you from the floor, and the answer is very simple. On this platform here, we have a panel of formidable women, leaders and role models, both in their jurisdictions and internationally. And we also have two formidable moderators. And I have to tell you, I know my place. I don't propose to rehearse the CVs of these great women because you have them in your program. Rather, let me briefly tell you the genesis of this event. Now, causation is a very familiar word to those of us in the law, and I can confidently say this. But for Professor Penny Andrews, this event would not have happened. That is because last year she had the inspired idea to invite Justice Sonia Sotomayor to give the annual law lecture at the University of Cape Town. The timing of that event was such that it coincided with a judicial leadership course that I was running at the Judicial Institute for Africa, which is based at the university. So I was delighted. Rather cheekily, I asked Penny whether she could persuade Justice Sotomayor to do a fireside chat with the Chief Justices and senior judges the night before the public lecture. She did, and she also interviewed Justice Sotomayor, and it was a very, very pleasant evening indeed. At the end of the evening, Justice Sotomayor and I were chatting together and making a plan about how we could meet in the future. And I said, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could get you and Brenda, as we fondly know Lady Hale, to do an event together? Well, by the time I got back to London, my idea got rather grander. And I thought, well, why not every corner of the world? So I got in touch with Lady Hale and asked her if she would be prepared to take part in such an event. Well, of course, she said. And she said, what's more, I'd like it to be hosted at Gray's Inn as part of the centenary celebrations. And here's the thing, because she told me, all those names you've given me are all honorary benchers of Gray's. So pure serendipity, and it was meant to be. A few days later, I was at the Association of Women Solicitors annual garden party, handing out some prizes. I spotted Dana and we had a chat. I told her about my idea, and she immediately offered to organize the event. So here we are. Now, sadly, Justice Sotomayor is not with us today. She fell and broke her shoulder and thus is unable to travel. Before I hand over to Penny and Genevieve, I just want to say a big thank you. Thank you to our distinguished panelists and moderators for agreeing to take part. And I just add in passing that both of our moderators are firsts in their own right. Master Treasurer, Tony Harking and Gray's Inn for hosting this event. Dana Dennis-Smith, the volunteers, and all the unseen people for the organisation, and you, the audience, for making this idea become a reality. And so without much more ado, I'll hand over to Penny and Genevieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dame Dobbs, and good evening. I'd like to start with a question that is a fairly familiar one, but I think an important question about your role. You were the first women in a very male-dominated profession. So my question is, what prompted you to enter the profession and then to want to ascend the ranks of the judiciary? And maybe we could start with Justice Wood.
Thank you very much indeed. If I had been asked, what would you like to, profession, would you like to enter? When I was about 12, I definitely would have said, I want to be a medical doctor. And the reason is because I thought medicine was the most visible way by which you could help people who were suffering and are in pain and needed relief. Now, I had a very good father, parents, but particularly my father was quite enlightened, and he invested all his resources in his children, male and female. There was absolutely no discrimination. So in my home, I never heard my parents say that it's only women who can be lawyers or only women who can enter a particular profession. They supported you to be the best that you can. He died at age 98, just 2 weeks before I retired. And so I was sent to one of the best, if not the best, girls' secondary school in Ghana. Now, by the time I got to Form 5, and I sat for the O-levels, and the results came, nobody would tell me, you can't go into medical practice, because the results did not favor me. But I had a very strong arts background. I loved reading from childhood. I had a very inquiring mind, and I loved to help people and to settle differences. And so, obviously, I had to divert into art subjects. And I did quite well. And at university level, my brother, who had then, he was a year older than me, and had managed to get into medical school, told me there is a good faculty of law in Ghana. And to tell you frankly, you appear to have the skills of a lawyer. And so together with my father, he urged me to try my hands at law. You know, in my time, and we're looking at the mid-1960s, we did not have proper career guidance counseling. And so my father and my brother, you know, as it were, helped me to find my way around which profession, you know, I think I would do well in and serve my country. So I entered law school, but not after very stiff competitive exams, written, and then oral exams. And to get a graduate degree meant you had to do 3 years of hard work, which I did and qualified. But by the time I had gone through the 3 years, I had decided that I will invest my life in the judiciary, in judging. And so after the professional law course, I applied first to the Ghana Police Service to be a prosecutor, because I had planned to join the judiciary at a very early age. And that meant you could only start as a magistrate. And the bulk of magisterial work had to do with criminal cases. And so being a public prosecutor for the Ghana Police Service, you know, gave me quite a lot of experience. You know, of course, we also did civil work. And that's how come, after 3 years, I applied and was made a magistrate of the Ghana Judicial Service. And I worked continuously for a period of 42 years. 42 years, you know, and of course you have to justify elevation from one level to the other. But if I tell you that I made up my mind, definitely that I will become Chief Justice, I would be telling a lie. You know, I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. And that's how come I was nominated, vetted by the Parliament of Ghana, and approved by consensus as the Chief Justice of Ghana. But also to let you know that along the way, people kept telling me, you are going to be Ghana's first Chief Justice. And it did happen. Thank you.
Chief Justice Kiefel?
I had a similar problem with vocational guidance at my school. So, and I think this was a fairly common experience in Australia at the time. For a young girl dreaming of higher education, the suggestions were teaching or nursing. Both noble professions, but I was not attracted to either of them. And I was pretty convinced that there were other things offering out there. So I left school early to go and work as a secretary to find them, and studied the rest of my qualifying years, matriculating years at high school at night, while I worked around, and then found myself working for a group of barristers. And this gave me the opportunity, it was a great opportunity to watch people working closely and how they interacted too, which I found quite interesting. What I came to know to be the camaraderie of the bar, and I was quite attracted to that as much as the work, I think. And so I finished my schooling at night, studied law at night, and went to the bar. And it helped me, probably with hindsight, quite a lot, that I had known of women in the past who had been practicing barristers. So the true trailblazers in Australia were people like Joan Rosenoff, who practiced at the Melbourne Bar in the 1950s, and Roma Mitchell, who was at the South Australian Bar. And but Joan Rosenoff had died before I was admitted to the bar in 1975, and Roma Mitchell was appointed first Supreme Court judge in Australia in 1965. Very few women had followed in their footsteps. There just didn't seem to be any momentum at all. In Queensland, where I went to the bar, there was had only been one woman who lasted a short time, then went into legal publishing in Sydney. But in the year I was admitted, there were 3 of us admitted in the same year, in 1975. And now, by comparison, the bars of the eastern states, which are the largest bars in Australia, women account for 25% of the bars there now. I found my time at the bar terrific. I had a great professional life with its usual sort of terrifying moments, but all of that, I really enjoyed it. But I knew from a fairly early time in my appearances in court that there was probably something more satisfying about being a judge. At a number of levels, I suspected it was intellectually more satisfying, as much as I loved being a barrister and a QC. And that's how I found it to be. I was not disappointed. And of course, it was up to others to appoint me. But there was at the time, so this is the early 90s, a developing political will in Australia to start appointing women. So much so that for particularly the women who followed, they were appointed rather quickly, far more quickly than men. As soon as they took silk, they were up for grabs. And the downside of that, for the bar, I think, was that mentors were taken away. And I think with hindsight that the propping up of the judiciary with women had a downside. But that seems to be evening out now. But now I have a terrific time working in an incredibly collegiate court with some of the best legal minds in Australia. So.
Thank you. Chief Justice McLachlin.
Well, thank you. I've been listening to these stories and noting similarities. I certainly didn't grow up thinking I'd be a lawyer, but I did think somewhere in my heart that I wanted to do something different and I wanted to be independent, because I saw people like my mother who were the beneficiaries of what they call first wave feminism, which was get the legal rights, get the right to vote, and everything was going to be fine. And things weren't fine for a lot of those women. And so I thought, something has to change. We have to move on. And I knew that in high school, but there were some discouraging moments when I had the same problem with counseling. In grade 8, they gave us all tests, and when it was done, the teacher took me aside, and she said, I don't know what to tell you, and I didn't say anything. And she said, you have a very high reading retention score, one of the highest we've ever seen, but a girl can't do anything with that. And then she shook her head for a while, and there was a little mumbling about teacher, or no, you can't be a nurse. And then she said, I have two things I can tell you must never be. And I looked at her, and she said, you must never be a telephone operator or a waitress. So I had to be a lawyer. Actually, I did philosophy, and when I did philosophy, I read Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. And it's a very long book, a very complicated book, but the central idea is that women have always been treated as the other, that they have been treated as different and outside. Of course, they are different, but they have been treated as people who cannot join the mainstream of life. And that changed my thinking. I thought that was what was wrong with first wave feminism. Give them the right to vote, give women the right to vote, shut them up, they'll be happy. But it wasn't like that. The cultural traditions and the social traditions, all were still telling girls and women of my age, that subtly, not directly, you can't really make it. It's a man's world out there. And I kind of rebelled against that, but I didn't know whether I'd do law. I was thinking maybe. And then a good friend, who later became my first husband, said to me, and he had a mother who was a doctor and a grandmother who was bursar of a university. And he said, so he had a strong sense that women could do whatever they wanted to do. And he said, I think you'd be really good at law. So I went down to my little town, which is in the ranching district in southern Alberta, and I wrote to the dean and I said, will you give me some information on studying law? And he wrote back and said, you're admitted. So when September came, I said, I'll go and try this, and I've been there ever since.
Thank you. Lady Hale?
Well, I too have been thinking about the similarities. The story I always tell about why I chose to study law at university was that my headmistress told me I wasn't clever enough to read history. That's a bit of an exaggeration. She basically thought I was clever enough to go to Oxford or Cambridge, but I wasn't a natural historian. So she was casting around for something else that I might read. And she suggested economics, and I'm afraid I am not a good theoretician. So I wasn't too keen on the idea of economics, but I had been fascinated by the constitutional history that we had done as part of the history course, and so I said, well, what about law? And instead of saying nonsense, girls don't do law, which she might well have done because she was quite a traditionalist, she said, that's a good idea. I can't help you, can't give you any advice, don't know anything about it, but we'll encourage you as best we can. And it turned out that I was right. I didn't expect to be right. I got to Cambridge and thought, I come from this tiny girls' school in North Yorkshire, first girl from the school to go to Cambridge, first girl from the school to study law, I'm going to be getting a tutu, bumping around, you know. And then I'll go back to North Yorkshire and be a solicitor in maybe my hometown, maybe a slightly bigger town. Yeah, that's what I'll go and do. And then I found out I was rather good at law, and I started getting firsts. And I met all these men who took it for granted that they were going to have successful careers, you know, doing this, that, or the other. And I thought, well, if they think that, why don't I think it too? So I rather changed my ideas in the course of my 3 years in Cambridge. But I didn't think I could go to the bar because I didn't think I could afford it. I was offered articles with the Magic Circle London firm, but didn't fancy, actually, sort of what I'd seen. I'd spent a month there in my long back, and I didn't really fancy the sort of culture. But I could easily get a job teaching law at the University of Manchester. And the University of Manchester said, we'd like you to qualify as a barrister and do some practice. So I thought, that's a good idea, that's the best of all possible worlds. And at that stage, you can't do it anymore, but at that stage, you could qualify as a barrister by doing the bar exams by a self-tuition correspondence course. So that's what I did. I bought a self-tuition correspondence course, which was some nutshells and some model exam papers and some model answers, and I spent 2 months over the first long back of my teaching career studying for the bar finals. It's a good illustration of how easy the bar finals were in those days, because I came top of the list, whereas all of those people who'd had proper courses, you know, didn't. And then I got a pupillage in Manchester, and I spent a few years at the Manchester Bar doing general common law practice as well as teaching at the Manchester University, which was wonderful. I loved it. But, of course, the practice suffers if you've got inconvenient things like students to look after, and the students, or at least the academic career, suffers if you've got no time to be doing the research and the writing that goes with being a successful academic. So I was put to my election, both by Chambers and by the university, and I chose to stay in the university. So it never occurred to me that I would become any sort of judge. How did that happen? Well, everything that I then did as an academic led directly or indirectly to a public appointment. So the first thing I did was write a book about mental health law. That's because I was teaching it and there wasn't a book. The best way to learn anything is to write a book about it. And that got me my first judicial job as a presiding member of mental health review tribunals, deciding whether people should remain detained in hospital. Absolutely fascinating. Very, very like family adjudication as well, because you're looking to the future, you're managing risk, you're looking at human beings. It was challenging but lovely. Then I helped to start up a learned journal on social welfare law, and that led to my appointment as a member of the Council on Tribunals, which used to supervise all our administrative tribunals and inquiries. And that taught me a lot, because I used to pot around watching how other people did tribunal work and putting in little reports about it, saying good things about it and bad things about it, and so on and so forth. But this was all Lord Chancellor's stuff, you know, the Lord Chancellor being then head of judicial appointments. And so I got a phone call from somebody in judicial appointments to say, Brenda, would you like to come down? And we're thinking of diversifying the judiciary. They didn't mean women. They didn't mean ethnicity. They meant a few academics with practicing experience. Let's have a few of them appointed as recorders. You know, baby part-time judges in Crown and County Courts. And I went down to see this very smooth gentleman, wonderful gentleman in many ways, and after having spoken to me for 3/4 of an hour, it was a bit like my headmistress really, he said, well, now I've met you, Brenda, and now we've had this conversation, is there something you would rather do? So I got the slight impression that he didn't think I'd be suitable. Anyway. I, of course, said, yes, of course I'm going to do it. You know, you've had this idea, I'd never have thought of it, but you've had it, I'm going to do it. Anyway, and then the last thing I did academically was, with a colleague, I wrote a case book on family law, which tried to be a multidisciplinary case book on family law, And that, I think, is what led to my appointment as Law Commissioner. And so those things all led, one way or another, to somebody eventually plucking up courage to offer me a full-time judicial post. And after that, I was on my own. So that's how it happened. It certainly never occurred to me that I would be any sort of judge, and certainly not what was then a senior law lord, now President of the Supreme Court. That did not cross my mind.
Thank you.
Penny, may I add something?
Yes.
Beverley's story reminds me that very recently I found my paperback copy of de Beauvoir's The Second Sex that I read when I was 18, and I was interested to see the bits that I underlined and all the exclamation marks. So yes, we had a similar experience.
Yes.
Well, I read Betty Friedan's, Feminine Mystique.
I read that.
And also, of course, then Germaine Greer, who must have influenced a whole load.
Well, this was a time when, second wave feminism was getting going, and the people we've discussed were the people who were saying we need to move on, and part of that, we need to get equality, we need to end discrimination, and part of that was getting, allowing women to have careers in areas where there had been a few perhaps, but not very many.
Yeah.
And so in the 70s, we saw this huge rush of women going into law schools for the first time in Canada. And that was a very big change in the feminist movement.
And we've seen the change now. Law schools today are overwhelmingly, more women are going to law school than ever before, and many law schools have plus 50% female law students, but for different reasons, I think.
You're all obviously just great pioneers and wonderful role models for women in general, not just lawyers. What has been the most challenging period of your careers? And what has been the best and most rewarding periods? We'll start with you, Chief Justice Kiefel.
Well, there have been many challenges. When I started at the bar, I was familiar with a number. It was quite a small bar, so I was quite familiar with a lot of the bar. And I'd worked as a law clerk, so I sort of knew my way around some of the solicitors' firms, but I hadn't really encountered judges. And they had a lovely custom in those days where new barristers paid a call on each Supreme Court judge. And so I had many pleasant cups of tea, and most of them looked pretty interested or expressed interest in what I was doing, so I thought that was all pretty good. There was only one who suggested that I might give up this as a rather foolish idea and make my career a family. And I was a little taken aback by this, but I thought, he probably just wants me to be as happy as his wife was. So I didn't let that dissuade me too much. And then when I took silk, that was a bit of a risk. There hadn't been a woman silk in Queensland. And I'd have to say, solicitors had become a bit more used to briefing juniors, but it struck me that, and it was a bit of a stretch to get them to brief you as a leader. And so some of the juniors that I had worked with before I took silk used to quite often try to break it down a bit by suggesting that they have a conference. The clients have a conference with me to see if I could sort of allay their fears. And one particular that George Brandis, who was the former Commonwealth Attorney General, is now the High Commissioner in London here. He was the junior in this case, and he suggested that this a very establishment firm brief me in a competition law case as the leader. And the client was a group of country livestock auction agencies. So the conference is duly convened, and my chambers are filled to overflow with rather large men with big Akubra hats and double-pocketed shirts and R.M. Williams boots, all looking quite uncomfortable. And it's quite tense for a while. But this is the 1980s, and people smoked then. So I said, would anyone mind if I smoked? And as expected, they said they didn't. So I opened my drawer and took out a packet of loose-leaf tobacco, a cigarette paper, proceeded to roll it by hand as I continued to talk with them, tapped it, licked one end, as one does, lit the other, inhaled, and you could hear there's an audible sigh of relief in the room. The conference went well and we won the case. As a judge, when I was appointed to the Supreme Court of Queensland, I hadn't done much crime, and in those days they had this rather charming baptism for new judges. They just threw commercial people straight into full-scale crime, so you'd have your murder trial within 2 weeks. So that was pretty challenging, but I enjoyed them, and now I've had the benefit of that experience. But I'd have to say that the most rewarding professional time of my life has been as a judge. It's just 25 years now. And especially now, the best time is really now.
Lady Hale?
Most challenging? Well, I think everything, really, if I'm honest about it. You know, school was challenging. University was challenging. Starting teaching was challenging. I'll never forget the terror when I first got to my feet in my barrister's robes in the Manchester Crown Court. It was only a bail application, but I was absolutely scared rigid. And it was worse still when I went into the Manchester County Court with a couple of undefended divorces just after they had gone into the county court. They used to be in the High Court, you see, and that meant only barristers could appear and could draft the petitions. But then when it went into the county court, solicitors could draft the petitions. And these were two really, really straightforward, undefended divorces. And the judge behaved disgracefully. He tore these two petitions to shreds while the poor petitioner was in the witness box, no doubt, very nervous about this whole thing. The result was never in doubt. He was always going to grant the decree. And he probably didn't know it was only about the second time I'd been on my feet in court, but it was the clients I felt really sorry for. It was terrible. He obviously realised that he'd been behaving badly because he called me in later and offered me a cup of tea. He didn't apologise. But he did say, oh, these solicitors, they're so terrible, you know. So, that sort of thing that was going on then doesn't go on now. I mean, I don't only mean the anti-solicitor thing. I mean the judges behaving badly does not go on in the same way that it did in those days, I think. It's partly to do with judicial training, partly to do with people not putting up with it anymore, and maybe it's partly to do with judges being a bit nicer. I don't know. But it was challenging at the bar. It was challenging teaching. I felt really challenged when I went to the Law Commission, because here were these great big brains, and was I going to be able to make a contribution to the reform of the law? Judging, of course, every bit of judging is challenging when you first do it. And imagine what it's like as the first woman law lord, turning up on the law lord's corridor with great people like him in charge, and thinking, well, am I ever going to be able to, work on equal terms with these great people? So, as I say, everything's been a challenge. But I've enjoyed it, of course. It's always been good. It's always been worthwhile. It's always been worth trying to live up to the challenge, do one's best. Rewarding is really difficult because it's all been rewarding too. I know it's a boring answer, isn't it? But it's true. But I always ask myself, which was more rewarding? 9.5 years at the Law Commission, making proposals for the reform of the law, most of which got enacted and are therefore now the law. So there's a lot of the law that I can look at and think, well, I had a bit of a hand in that. Or, of course, being in the Supreme Court, the Law Lord and Supreme Court, and having a hand in developing the law through case law. And there are some judgments that I've given, or some results that I've persuaded colleagues to, that I'm really proud of. So I don't know, as between those two, which it is. I'm never entirely sure. Either way, it's all been fun.
Chief Justice McLachlin?
Well, I think I'll take a narrow view of what are the most difficult times. Everything's been challenging. But what are the really difficult times when my soul was seared and when I thought I couldn't go on? And that's what I'm thinking about. The first was after having graduated from law school at the top of the class, and I went for an interview for articles with a gentleman who was a bench of the Law Society. He had taught me. He was someone I admired, very civilized. And we had a lovely interview, and I thought everything's going fine. I'm going to get the job. And I'm the only person who's interrupted herself on her cell phone. I apologize. And that's just in case anyone wasn't paying attention. And he said, oh, just one more thing. He said, why do you want to practice law? And I just sat there. I'd studied for 7 years. I'd studied law for 3 years. I was there to get a job. Why was he asking me this? And I was completely flustered and ran literally out of the room. And I only learned later that when I talked to somebody about it, that there was an expectation at the time that if you were, and he said this to me, he said, well, you're married, aren't you? And I had got married the previous summer. And the expectation was that if you were married, you would devote your whole life to your husband and the family, and you could not practice law. So I went across the hall and I got a job. But there was a time I thought that's the end of my career. I didn't know it was that after all I've done, I'm going to face this hurdle. Because I had the temerity to get married, I can now no longer practice law. Anyway, that passed. And the second period when I thought I was going to go under was the first period of my articles, when literally I had a very good firm, but they just threw everything at you. And, you know, I got this file the first day, just had something about a mechanic's lien. What's a mechanic's lien? I said, I can't do this. I'm going to fail. And then the next day it was file a statement of claim, and then go on this discovery, and then go over to police court and defend this person. And I had no idea how to do anything. I'd studied torts and constitutional law, and nobody was really giving me much. But, you know, it was a great experience in retrospect, but I was sure that I was failing. So after 6 months, the senior partner said, we need to have lunch. So we went down and had lunch, and it was all very nice. And I thought, well, now he's going to tell me that, you know, they don't need me to stay on. And he said, oh, you're the best article student we've ever had. And I dropped my fork, literally, you know. So that taught me a lot, both those experiences. When you think the bottom's falling out of your world, when you think you can't get through, think again. You may be underestimating yourself. You may be running up against a prejudiced opinion that doesn't really matter, and just plow on. And if I've had any success, I think it's because I've kind of developed a very callous carapace that I just go on with what I think is right. A difficult time for me was when I was practicing law, and I was also teaching, and I had a child. And my husband and I shared parenting duties, but it was extremely stressful. And it wasn't difficult because I felt I wasn't doing well at my job. At that time, I had confidence that I could be a good lawyer, I could be a good teacher, I knew what I was doing. It was difficult because I feared that I was being the worst parent in the world. And that was hard for me. There were days I really thought I've failed at being a good parent. Fast forward 20 years, I said to my son, I said, you know, it still bothers me. I wasn't a very good parent. I was out running jury trials. I was doing this, that. I wasn't there for you when I should have been. And he just looked at me and he said, get over it, Mom. You were great. And you know, a lot of the agonies we do put ourselves through are just that. I later talked to a woman who is a terrific mother, and she'd raised 8 wonderful children to adulthood. And I said, well, what? And I'd by this time seen a lot of bad parenting in the courts. And I'd seen good parenting too, but I could never figure out I could always figure out why it was bad, but I couldn't figure out what does it take to be a good parent. You have to do all these things, go through all these rotas, take your children to all these lessons, be there every time they cry or skin their knee. So I said to this lady who had been so successful at parenting, what is essential for parenting? And she said, to be a good mother. And she said, she thought about it, and she said, you've got to be a strong person, and you've got to give unconditional love. And I thought that's exactly the way it was. So when I look back over my really tough times, first day in court was terrible. The people I was supposed to be judging went out in the hall and settled. I came back and said, I guess they didn't like the new judge. And the court clerk saved me. He said, oh, no, I heard them talking. It was just that you were listening so hard, and they got thinking about their case, and he was such a sweetheart. So the long and the short of it is, you will have, if you're in any profession, but if you're a woman in a profession, you'll have more of them, bad moments when you think it's the end, when all the guys get together after your great victory in court and they go to the men's only club and you're the only one at home. That's not a good moment. But my advice to younger women who are going through this is just keep your head up and plow on, and you'll win in the end.
Wood?
Thank you. I served as Chief Justice for 10 years, the longest serving Chief Justice in our country, and as a judge for 32 years. So I'll start with the positive, the rewarding. As Chief Justice, you probably all know that Ghana has had a tortuous past, and only 25 years ago reverted to constitutional democracy. Ghana has had a relatively peaceful and stable period for the past 25 years. And we shouldn't forget the fact that the judiciary has contributed significantly to this Pacific period that we've enjoyed. So we have contributed, and I find that rewarding. Now, as a judge, my happiest moments are when people come to my court, and even in exceptional cases, losing parties will tell you they appreciate that justice has been served. That's when I am most happy. And then, although I support women's rights and so on, I make sure that I judge in accordance with the law and the facts. So when men come to my court and then they also obtain justice, you can see the satisfaction in their faces, because I think that they have this notion that women have banded together and will never be fair to them when they come before them. And I try as much as possible to dispel that notion. And one case that I specifically dealt with gives me so much satisfaction. It's reported in our law reports. In applying a specific law, to parties, it normally tends to work in favor of women, because it's the men who, sorry to say, die first before the women. So when it comes to intestacy, the law says that, the first house goes to a spouse. So unfortunately, in this instant case, the woman died, and the family rushed to court thinking that as a female judge, I was going to favor them. And I said, what is sauce for the goose is equally sauce for the gander. And the man got judgment. So the really good moments are when justice has been served, but as my colleagues have rightly stated, there are challenging moments. as Chief Justice, in a developing country, you can't imagine, where you make up your mind that you are going to protect the independence of the judiciary, come what may. Both institutional independence and substantive or decisional independence. And that's one of the things I fought for. I ensure that the independence of the judiciary, remained intact, never to be shredded into bits or pieces. Now, we did have an election dispute, and that also was a very trying moment for Ghana. We did. And of course, people say we did not do as well as Kenya because it took an awfully long time for the dispute to be settled. But it was finally settled, and Ghana moved on. Now, unfortunately, also, a number of judges were caught in a not so pleasant situation where they were found by an undercover agent to have engaged in acts of impropriety, corruption to be specific. But thank God, I had a very strong and independent judicial council, and we were determined that this was not a matter which was to be swept under the carpet, and we took all the constitutional steps to have those errant judges removed. Obviously, that was a very trying moment for the Chief Justice of Ghana. And as I said, as a developing country, having to deal with a lack of resources and so on, can really be challenging. But if you have a strong, independent mind, and if you are the person who, when he or she holds a plow, does not look back, you keep on moving and doing the best that you can under any given circumstances.
Can I just come in on one little thing? When I was Chief Justice, at one point, the Prime Minister of Canada issued a public attack against me and accused me of impropriety. And there was no impropriety, but it was a very, very difficult moment. It's difficult to, I was in a hotel in a regional area and I had to get an early flight, so at 4 a.m. I went down to the desk and there I saw a headline that the Prime Minister had accused me of impropriety. And it's a very, very difficult thing it was a difficult flight. So I got back to Ottawa in my office, and someone said to me, I talked to some of the senior people, and they said, well, you shouldn't do anything because, judges can't respond, but more to the point, you'll never win this fight, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought about it, and I said, well, I have to at least do enough that the Canadian public knows what the facts are. So I issued a very short statement where I said, I've done nothing wrong. These are the facts. And I said 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when the chronology, and I had all the dates and everything, and when the chronology became known, the thing he was accusing me of just could not have happened. And so that was a very, very bad time. What was good about it was that the legal institutions, the bar institutions, academe, and ordinary Canadian men and women were outraged at this attack. And they came to my side, and I was completely vindicated. International groups demanded the Prime Minister apologize. He never did, although he kisses me on the cheek every time I run into him. But it's not quite the same. But, again, it was a very difficult time. And as you say, there can come moments when you have to stand up for the independence of the judiciary. And I think of the Chief Justice of Poland now, who is doing that. These are very, very difficult times. And we have to, if you're in that position, I think you have to stand up. You have to get at least minimal facts out. At that point, I ended it. I wasn't going to engage in a tit for tat or an argument. Just get the facts out, people will judge. And the good thing about my country is that the institutions and the respect for the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law were so strong that in the end, the judiciary emerged from that strengthened. And it is perhaps not always that way in some parts of the world. But these are fights we will more and more have, I think, because we're living in a time when there's some unraveling of the ideas that have carried us through the last 20 or 30 years, the importance of the rule of law and independence of the judiciary. So that was my really most difficult moment.
Thank you.
If I could, I thought these kinds of things happen only in developing countries. If I hadn't heard your story, I wouldn't have known that the Chief Justices of the first world, so to speak, can come under attack. But it does happen in my country, and whilst as Chief Justice, I had a few of these moments where they would even call on you to resign. But you know what? I always say that your work and your integrity and your character will always stand for you. You know, I was invited by the government of Kenya to do some work for them. That's the Kenyan judiciary had to be vetted. So I left Ghana and then went to Kenya. I do that at 2 monthly intervals. And what I said to myself is, I've left the cupboard, I've left the keys to the cupboard. If there are any skeletons, bring them out. And none was ever brought out.
Thank you. Those are brilliant examples. Thank you so much.
I'd like to ask how your experiences in life have influenced your judgments. And maybe we'll start with you, Justice McLachlin.
Well, you know, judges are human beings, and everything you've experienced in life somehow impacts. But when I look back, I think the fact that I grew up in a very diverse community where there were people of all sorts. There were indigenous people, there were people of different European backgrounds, there were people sometimes who came from other parts of the world, and that really led me to an appreciation of the place of everybody in the world, and kind of laid the values that later led me to embrace human rights and the dignity of every individual. That seemed to me very, very important, and my parents insisted on that when we were growing up. They really believed the biblical maxim that the Lord is no respecter of persons, and that everybody is imbued with dignity and should be treated equally. So that was a hugely important lesson that I learned as a child, and that was before people talked about equality very much or discrimination. But it has infused my whole thinking and my whole life.
Lady Hale?
Isn't it? And you've said this, that women do lead different lives from men. We don't do it by choice. We are women, and so we do. And some of the reasons why it's different is that people react to us in different ways. Expectations there may be, the way in which one's treated, just are different. And so the experience of being a woman, which is half the human race, is just as important to feed into the judging and the practice of the law as is the experience of men. And so your point about women being regarded as other and not exactly real people, just kind of subsidiary people, clearly is wrong. And one does grow up in our generation with quite a sense of that. Even if people around one are, on the whole, pretty appreciative and pretty understanding. You know, the experience of being a very small proportion of the undergraduates at Cambridge, because there was a built-in quota with there being only 3 women's colleges and 21 men's colleges, meant we all had a lovely time, but it was obviously wrong, and we were very much on our own. And then starting out at the bar, when I was the second woman in the set of chambers that I joined, huge tribute to the first, but again, it was very wrong. There were very few women around, and one was very conscious of how few of us there were, and therefore the need not to pretend to be anything other than one was. I feel that very strongly. I think women should be themselves and not feel that they have to conform to male role models in order to get on and succeed, especially in the law. So I think all of that. I think the experience of being employed. I realised a little while ago that I was probably the only member of my court I was the only member of my court who'd spent the whole of her professional life in employment. I mean, I spent some time self-employed at the bar, but everybody else had spent most of their professional life, before they became a judge, self-employed at the bar. And I think that that means that certain types of case one does approach a little bit differently. Cases about employment and equality in employment, and we have a lot of those. Because one has had that experience. And I know that Sian Elias says an important part of life's experience that does inform one's judging is the experience of humiliation. And most women, professional women, have experienced humiliation at one point. Well, you've given some examples of that. And being turned down when you're clearly the best qualified person for the job, that's an experience that in retrospect, I was very glad that I didn't get the 3 professorships that I applied for at various universities, because I wouldn't be doing my current job had I got any of those professorships. But I did feel humiliated at the time, because I was fairly sure, at least with 2 of them, that I was the best qualified person for the job. And all of these sorts of experience feed into one's judicial experience, and that's good. It's how things should be. Judges shouldn't only be supremely successful, self-confident, always getting their own way, always feeling that they are entitled to be doing what they were doing. If that's the only sort of judge we have, I don't think that's good for the law or for society.
Chief Justice Wood? Well, I find this question a bit difficult to answer, because as a judge, I made sure I tried as much as possible not to let life's experiences weigh, in the decisions that I give, in the sense that even if the evidence doesn't favor one party, because A, B, and C happened to you, therefore, the result must go a particular way. I don't think that that's what you imply from the question, no. Except to say again that there are some values which I acquired early on in life, and through school, through secondary education, tertiary, and which, of course, shapes one's mind and one's perception of what is right and what is wrong, and one of them, obviously, is equality under the law. As she rightly stated, everybody must be treated equally. So with that as my basic guiding principle, I must say that I think I was able to do quite what I would, fair sense of justice.
Just taking up on the point about values, that I think they view so much of what you do as a judge. And I think a value system is common to all judges. I don't think male or female. There's a differentiation there. And I was brought up with Christian values. They kind of morphed into ethical, moral values. They're an important part of who I am. In terms of experience, I was not brought up with a privileged background. I had no introduction into anywhere. I left school and worked at 15. I've been working since I was 15. I think those kind of things shape how you view the world and how you see people in it. But I think you could have a long debate about how much of an experience of being a woman actually affects judgment. It might affect your view of the world when you get annoyed, but when you're actually coming to write a judgment, how much of that and in what areas it truly seeps through. And I'm not sure that we're in the best position to determine our own insights. I mean, the areas where it's obviously, I would have thought, more likely to occur would be, say, crime and family law, where the experience is probably more directly comes through. But even then, you can have. I'll leave it for the academics to debate these things. But for me, it's people as much as events which have shaped my way of thinking as a judge. So in terms of events, the standout would be the opportunity to do a master's in Cambridge and have people like Sir David Williams and Tony Jolowitz teach me. I mean, it was just a privilege. And Tony Jolowitz introduced me to comparative law. It's kind of opened up my whole way of the lens through which I looked at some of the law, and it's an interest that I've maintained through contact through academic friends and with European comparative law institutes. So, and over the years, all the judges you speak to, and as a barrister, I was very observant and interested in how different judges write, and I was particularly attracted to Sir Harry Gibbs' writing because he had this beautiful clarity and simplicity and conciseness in the way he wrote, and I'm sure that has influenced me very much in the way I approach writing a judgment, the style and all of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, you've all been trailblazers. With this in mind, what would you like your legacy to the law to be? Justice Kiefel, start with you.
Well, I assume that means, how do I want to be remembered?
Not on your tombstone.
I think I've probably left my run a little late to write a major treatise. So I'll leave that to one side. And I'm realistic enough to know the percentage of reported cases which remain relevant over a long period of time. So not worried about that particularly. I think it would be the topic I've just left. I'd like to be remembered for someone who promoted a style of judgments and collegiate judgment making which allowed for the development of concise, clear judgments that make it easier for people to understand the judgment that has social importance, and makes it easier for judges in lower courts to apply the law rather than judges showing off about how clever they are in individual judgment writing. And that requires that there are fewer judgments written at higher appellate levels. That requires a bit of hard work on the part of judges because it means that you have to confer a lot more. You have to sort of put a bit of vanity aside, as David Newberger has said once, vanity judgments. And you have to develop a more institutional approach rather than an individualistic approach. And I'd like to think that I've encouraged that. The other aspect is that over my 25 years now, I've had 36 associates, which are legal researchers, mostly young women, with whom I've worked closely and with whom I maintain contact. They've mostly become very good lawyers. Some of them even took up rowing under my influence. I'd like to think that they took into their professional lives and into their lives more generally a part of what they experienced in their time with me, and that it was useful. And I think that then carries through the generations.
Lady Hale?
Oh dear. This really is a difficult question, because one is very much aware that legacies don't last very long. I think I agree with everything that Chief Justice Kiefel said. I would like to be remembered by generations of students at the University of Manchester as somebody who increased their understanding of the law, increased their enthusiasm for the law, and got them on their way and encouraged them in their careers. I'd certainly like to be remembered in that way. I'd like to be remembered as a judge, especially now, in front of whom it is pleasant to appear. And I do try and create a pleasant atmosphere in court rather than, consistent with the seriousness of what is going on. I don't think there's any harm, in a lightness of touch. I'd like to be remembered for that style. And obviously I'd like to be remembered for one or two of the statutes on the statute book, which are the work of my team at the Law Commission. It wasn't me alone, it was very much teamwork. And a handful of judgments which have either changed the law or made people think differently about the law as it is. So all of those things. But I don't think I'm vain enough to think that that will last very long.
I'm sure it will. Yes, Chief Justice McLachlin?
Well, again, the legacy question is the tough one, isn't it? But I think I agree with everything that Susan says and everything that Brenda says. I would like to, in the course of my career, I had the very good fortune that my judicial career started a year before Canada adopted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms and carried on completely through. So it was a time of great legal change and social change, and I had the privilege to sit on a lot of really important cases that affected people's lives, and I believe often for the better, whether it's the right to die with dignity, gay rights, equality for transgender, some of these cutting social issues. I feel proud of those judgments. I feel that they've been advanced society, and when I see, a same-sex couple come up to me with tears in their eyes and say, "Thank you, you don't know what this means to us," I feel good. Did I set out to make that my legacy? Absolutely not. But looking back, it's been a great thing. On the administrative side, I agree entirely, or procedural. I think we have to, in this day and age, open up the courts, and something I tried hard to do as Chief Justice. I would say to people, I met a man outside the court one day, and he's looking at this big building, and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's the Supreme Court of Canada." And he said, "Can I go in?" I said, "Yes, it's your court. It belongs to you and people of Canada." And I tried to get that message across, that justice isn't the prerogative of a narrow profession and a few judges. Justice belongs to people. And people are, hardwired for justice. They get it. They understand if it's fair or if it isn't fair. They understand if the judge has looked at all sides of the picture or not. So we need to, or I tried very hard to open up the justice system, to demystify it a little bit, without in any way undermining the authority of the courts, but just to say this is a very important institution, and it's there to serve society and to serve you. We do that through clearer judgments. We do that through more consensus, which I worked hard to achieve on the Supreme Court of Canada. We do that by simply communicating in speeches or talks or question and answers, that we understand that the justice system belongs to the people. And above all, we do it by working for access to justice. And I've spent a lot of time trying to do that. And if there's one issue that I think I'd like to be my legacy, it'd be access to justice. Because if people can't access our beautiful justice system, it's not serving its purpose.
Thank you. Chief Justice Wood.
Thank you. I think the people of Ghana should be the best judges of what legacy I have left. Within the 42 years I've been in public office. Well, I do remember that when the University of Ghana Faculty of Law was 40 years old, the Faculty of Law recognized my contribution, and what they said of me, and I have no reason to doubt them, is that I was a judge of integrity. I wrote well thought out and well-reasoned judgments. And in actual fact, students tell me, you know, when they meet me, they tell me how some of their cases have impacted lectures and so on and so forth. As Chief Justice, I would want to be remembered as the Chief Justice who was fiercely protective of judicial independence, and who placed integrity, accountability, and hard work on a very high pedestal. Elevation to the Court of Promotions were, or in my time, and I believe it continues, was solely based on merit and not whom you knew or old boyism. I would also like to be remembered as the Chief Justice whose life impacted many young women, and I would say even children. And I'll share a brief story with you. I was having lunch in a hotel in Accra when an 8-year-old girl walked up to me, took my hand, and asked me, "Are you Georgina Wood?" And of course, I am. So I answered in the affirmative. So I asked her, "What can I do for you?" She said she came with the mom. So I invited the mom, and the mom said, "This young girl has said she wants to be a Georgina Wood." In other words, she wants to grow up to be a Chief Justice of Ghana. So in their home, they've abandoned her name and they call her Georgina Wood. You know, she's not the only one, but very many young people and the underprivileged. One of the initiatives I instituted was to hold a mentoring program, you know, for girls. Later on, we started adding young boys or young adults, you know, also because we believe that we are not in competition with the men. We are partners. And so they've got to understand where we are coming from, what our challenges and fears and concerns are, you know. And in this program, I do not only, I make it as diversified as possible. So people with disabilities, including the physically challenged, you know, sight-wise, including what in my home country we call girl porters, head porters. You know, they carry stuff for women who visit markets. We invite them, and with the assistance of the United Nations Population Fund, you know, we try and encourage them not to be satisfied with where they are, but to aspire, you know, to heights greater than what they can immediately see. And I remember the last one I held, they giving me an award and promising me that I shouldn't be surprised if one of them emerges as a lawyer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful.